Good morning. I've come to talk more about what I talked about last year. Last year I said they had this extraordinary theory, conjecture, proposal, and couldn't we do some mathematics about it. It petered out because I was on 40 pages, and I didn't do it fast enough. This year, the guy whose theory it is has produced a book, so I'm going to spend about 1.5 minutes doing that. Does anybody want to buy his fictionalized version, in which it's a fictionalized version of how his theory becomes famous? It cost him £4 each to do. If you don't like to do it now, you might like to do it at the end. But I said,
don't know without looking at it.
If I can't sell them to all these people, I'll give them away. So it's a reverse Dutch auction, in which a Dutch auction is where you...
Thank you.
I think the person with the lowest price wins. And in this one, the lowest price is 0, and wins if nobody wants to pay for it. So if anyone wants to look...
Do you have a standard price?
The £5 standard price. It costs £4 to do. It's mainly for his ego. If he's done it and paid for it, let's support him. That's my thought. He's already there. Oh, we've got one left over. The theory is this. Those who would like to do it might perhaps like to maybe write their name so he knows who's bought his book and put the money in here. Or say, I'll pay after lunch or something. So this is a circularizing means of exchange and purchase for those who have already purchased. Yes. Now, good morning to all. I've got you. Give me all I hope. My opinion poll on whether the steps in the theory, the proposal, are valid or not. I'm using, who was it?
Geoffrey Constable.
Geoffrey's wonderful idea of the truth likelihood. As you will remember, he said, by his own theory, he would give 100% TL, truth likelihood percentage, for C being better, 50% for his quantum jelly thing, and 30% for some of his other proposals. So I'm asking you, I've got 6 little proposals there which you'll hear, and I'm asking you to put your TL, truth likelihood percentage, opposite on this sheet, and if you're willing, put your name at the top, unless you are.
What not now, at the end
of the talk. What truth likelihood percentage would you attribute to the following proposals, ABC?
To what extent do we assent to this? Yes.
Yeah, if you think it's totally obviously true, you can say 100%. If you think it's complete rubbish, you put 0.
Right. So, for example, in number A...
You haven't heard whether their context nor their explanation yet, but you will.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, we're not to fill this out until after.
No, it's as it goes through. If you have a pen, you say yes or no as it comes up. Okay, we've done our Dutch auction in reverse. We'll now, remind everybody's way, where's one stand in this thing? Oh, next. Is it going to do me a next?
You have to arrow down, I think.
Not too happy with the next. Since it's Word and not PDF, I can easily do it here. So easy. Not worth wasting the time. Can we get a keyboard? Oh, even the keyboard's not happy. Let's go. Oh.
Yep.
Come on. Okay. So, this is like Greaves' theory that similarity propagates itself. To have a look at his theory, it's all very well, it's all totally quite theoretical. The purpose of this exercise is to try to put some quantification or mathematization into it, at which I'm a complete amateur, literally. I feel I'm in the way of something. Maybe I sit down. And so, the agenda here is to have a go at how his theory relates to the concept of similarity. First, I describe the conjectured phenomenon, which I call Greaves' repetition. Then I give its derivation, how he derives it in 6 steps, which I ask you to vote on, your truth likelihood percentage for each of them. There's a short foretaste of them, of no great importance, but that's the sort of thing we're going to have. Then I describe how nature uses this function in staggering ways, 2 especially. Then I say, okay, let's try to do something that looks a bit like mathematics. Now, I'm a nobody in mathematics, so you guys will take it off. Take off like a 747 with the idea. That's the purpose of it. looking for ways of quantifying degree of similarity, since it is similarity that causes the effect. You might call that a degree of departure from randomness. Somebody might like to use the word negative entropy. I'm not very good on know where to put the pins down in this golf course. And then I say, how might the operators that you use, function A, function B, function, how might they interact? And then I say, please, suggestions as how we can continue working now. Look, he says, there are three phenomena which all operate on the same principle. Memory, this is a surprise round, I didn't see it last year. Reproduction of form in living things, and electromagnetic induction. So his thesis is, when an event or a pattern is repeated with great similarity, there will be a tendency for that event or pattern to be repeated in the future or in current time at another place. If, most of his cases I believe, if an initial event of the sequence occurs at that remote time or space in the same or a similar physical medium, and I think in some of his cases, if the same medium is available in random state to receive it, like your brain has to be in random state to remember and to memorize. A part of your brain you put in that random state. Now just let me try to remember. That's the putting a bit of your brain in random state to pick it up from yesterday. So it comes out as a sort of Newtonian-like axiom. Equal intervals in time, similar actions tend to duplicate themselves. It's completely a radical idea. Through all space at one moment in time. Equal intervals in space, that is, similar structures, tend to duplicate themselves through all time in one location. Time and space are interchangeable in the definition. So that's his magnum opus. Here's a derivation, and what I'm going to ask you to put down a percentage of the degree to which you think it might be true in the piece of paper I've given you all. Anyone lacking that piece of paper? I may have one left.
Well, you have to write in this.
No good writing instrument.
Here's a second.
I got one extra pen left over.
Here's a whole stack of things.
Stack of pens?
Paper, I thought you said paper, sorry.
I got one pen for those. Anyway, if you can't now, you can't someone needs a pen.
What's the notion singularity in
No, I needs a pen.
means that it cannot be subjected to general laws?
This I'm about to tell you what we said last year.
So are you asking us to use
I know that
Yes, I'm asking you.
Alright, so let me ask you a
kind
question
of,
about number one.
it's a kind of
Heisenberg's uncertainty
notion
principle
which is
says that there's a
current
kind
in
of balance between
discussions
position and
in
momentum. It doesn't say we don't know where anything is.
I know, I
You're
say,
supposed to be going into that.
should have used the word
Supposed to,
brackets, shorthand.
you're supposed to cover it.
In other words, I'm giving a completely shorthand.
Yeah, but then I give you 0.
Okay, that's a bit purist, because what I'm saying is, please expand that statement, because you can see perfectly well what I'm getting at.
You understand what I'm telling you?
Yes,
I'm
I
not
understand.
prepared to answer your questions yet because I haven't understood your context well enough.
Yeah, okay, well, I apologise for using shorthand.
It'd be easy to answer them all at the end.
Okay, well, do it at the end if you wish. I can put this up on the end easily. Anyway, to expand then on A a bit. He says, no two things can be in the same place. Oh, we all know that. And if they were, he says, that would be a singularity. He goes back to what he perceives to be Heisenberg's theory principle, which I don't really know any more about than I should, as a pure layman, and says that specifies that it's rather hard to say where something is and what direction it's going in all at once. Therefore, if we could say that, it would be a singularity. It would be beyond our physics. It would be something that's impossible. Now, if we are...
Can I ask, your meaning by singularity is something very general in that sense?
I hope I fitted in his definition. Damn it, I'm going on this copy. Sorry. I put it in on the copy I put on the thing I used to make the print. His meaning of singularity is something like, I haven't got in my head, a thing you can get close to but can't reach, a state of affairs from which nature
Let me make a further comment. We don't know where anything is in an absolute sense, but we have some ability to understand how things are related to one another. And when we talk about where something is, we usually mean it in relation to something. So I know I'm a certain distance from the wall. But Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that my knowledge of how far I am from the wall in relation to my velocity is an interrelated situation. So if I don't know my velocity If I know my velocity very well, then I don't know where I am in relation to the wall. But it is a balanced situation between two things. And so you write it in an absolute way, and I don't understand what you mean at all.
Okay, I'm saying it leads to the concept that it's rather hard to say exactly where something is and how fast it's going at the same time.
Right, that's the principle.
Okay? Now, if you were to be able to state that this thing moving in that direction at that speed were an exact copy of this thing moving in that direction at the same speed, if the two systems, particles or whatever they happen to be, are exactly equal, that would be a singularity because it can't happen. So, if you get something that repeats so much that it comes very close to that singularity of perfect repetition, which challenges, quote Heisenberg,
I don't see how a repetition challenges Heisenberg.
well, because absolute repetition is impossible on this point. Absolute repetition is impossible because we cannot state that it is an absolute repetition. Because we don't, quote, know where
But
anything...
when I'm talking about repetition, for example, take this sheet of paper and a copy of it over here, or a mirrored copy of it. Then it's not moving relative to anything in the room, and I can lead with my leisure as an go back and forth between them and see how they match. Or I could even bring them on top of one another and match their patterns. I can do various things to find out whether things are similar or not.
On macro scale, you
And
can.
it isn't a matter of their relative velocity. In fact, I try to get rid of the problem of velocity altogether when I work with similarity.
You're jumping that step. Also, this doesn't apply to sheets of paper. This theory is applied to things at subatomic scale.
I understand that.
Okay. Where most things do have some kind of velocity, maybe.
Yes.
Anyway, the theory is you cannot state
But
that they're
again,
equal. So
if you're going to talk about that, you have to ask, what do you mean by similarity? Is there an observer who is going to examine the similarity?
Obviously, a very good
some kind
question.
of similarity outside of an observer.
But my only observer I've got so far at subatomic scale for this is God, who arranges the way things happen, and he's suggesting that God arranges that this happens. So you can put your zero down and allow me to continue from that. Because I was using a shorthand, and he's using a shorthand, and it seems to me a relatively intelligent shorthand. So B is a special case of A. He says if we could tell that they are in the same place, that fact would be a singularity, because we can't. And then he says, by extension, if any two arrangements are exactly the same in time or in space, at a subatomic Heisenberg-related scale, that would be a singularity. So he says, what happens when, well, which line am I on? If two patterns or events approximate to absolute singularity, it's to absolute similarity, they're approximating to a singularity. What happens when a singularity is approached? Well, what have we got? We've got things approaching the speed of light, and we know very strange things happen to mass and length and other perceived qualities. We know pretty strange things happen close to absolute zero temperature. And nobody really knows what goes on the border of a black hole. It's beyond what we can talk about. So he suggests, if absolute similarity were achieved, let's call our function infinity, then he says, well, maybe mass converts into energy or something? And then he says, no, nature will always swerve away from that. Some kind of minimum energy principle or something. And his proposal is that, looking at F there, nature transmits the similarity to somewhere else, in time or in space, to get away from having put up with being at a singularity. So there are my 6 things. You can say yes or no to them all. 0 to 100. And the purist approach, obviously, will zero all of them. But I'm trying to get beyond the totally purist mathematical description approach.
It's not mathematical. I'm up in the air as far as what's being meant operationally. It hasn't to do with mathematics.
Yes, well, right. Maybe I should say purist physics or something like that. Anyway, those are the things which I'm asking you to give a 0 to 100 on, but that is just because I'd really like to feel what everyone thinks about this. I just want to give a lecture and go away and everybody forgets it. I'd like to hear that I'm being told the whole thing's absolute nonsense, but then I'd like to know why, which is good. Or, hey, that's quite interesting. These 6 answers will give us a picture on that.
Can I try to re-summarize what you said? In essence, you say you can't step into the same river twice, that similarity, really close similarity between two things is a kind of singularity.
Really close
That's the
similarity
first
is a
one.
kind of singularity.
Yeah.
Approaches to absolute
And then you
similarity.
say that nature produces the singular effect of transmitting the similarity to another point in space or time to avoid the singularity, you might say. Similarity is transferred to avoid the
Well,
singularity.
the pressure of being close to a singularity is relieved by passing off the whole story to somewhere else in time and space.
It's a remarkable hypothesis, I like it.
It is a remarkable hypothesis, but since he says that he perceives it happening, he then tries to rationalize. The last time it came, I gave a thing this size that he wrote in 1978, imagining how the thing repeats because it's a millionth of a second behind the other one, the minimum energy principle. I can't actually take that and everyone's good.
Could
So-
we perhaps make it come a bit closer to our ordinary way of seeing things by suggesting it might be a way of talking about how some broad features occur in complex causal systems in general. It seems to me that we can't do it by going down to physics. There's too many barriers. But if we look at the broad perception of causal systems at least, possibly more than the broad perception, we might be able to get something out of this. Am I adding anything?
Well, you're in an area that, unfortunately, once you say square root of -1,
I can't go.
I'm not competent.
No,
So you're in an area that knows a lot of stuff, but I don't know how to manipulate it. I'd like to learn.
But if we look at, for instance, complexity in systems with
Complexity in general,
causal systems, yes. But if we then broaden that up to things like political systems, then you can get similarities that actually work across these vast differences. And it seems to me that we might get better if we try and apply it in that way.
To whole large-scale systems.
Well, they could be large scale. It could be a large scale system on a pinhead, of course, in the sense that it's complex.
Well, as I've either said or I'm about to say, one of them is extraordinarily complex and huge in macro scale, which is the reproduction of this body into another exactly similar body, which I'll discuss how, which is also why the oak tree produced a leaf that looks the same. And one of his examples is electromagnetic induction, which he says results from the electrons going past the point with great similarity, and therefore they produce a totally unexplainable effect, which nobody has explained, but everybody
But
knows.
speaking for myself, whereas the generalities are something one can get a bit of a purchase on, the examples are sort of, I can't really work that one. It's a sort of feeling that's coming out.
Interesting. Shall I continue?
Yeah, that's...
Okay, what are the effects? The concept develops, I've told you that, from this idea, derives from degrees of similarity that violate the quote Heisenberg limit quote. And the most immediate of these will be at subatomic scale. So you might interpret the requirement for violating that limit as need to, that the limit rules on probability expressed by the Heisenberg situation are infringed. Okay, now at subatomic scale it's relatively easy to achieve a high degree of repetition necessary for near violation of that limit. A high degree of departure from the random. So an event of high repetition at subatomic scale, he says, will create an effect with absolute reliability. And we see that, he says, when we pass electrons down the wire, and an effect appears a meter away. How does that happen? Right? It's going outside physics as Newton or anybody before anybody put anything down the wire knew it. It's a singularity, it's an effect created by a violation of near violation of singularity. Exactly that sort of disdain. So we get something that's measurable.
One more point. The thing that jumped out at the beginning was the assertion that things tend to be made the same. Well, the thing that is most dominant in my mind is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that chaos is the thing that propagates most of all. Things break their order and go into forms you can no longer categorise because they're into too high a dimension.
He is proposing that there is in nature a force that creates order that goes against entropy.
That's right, in the sense of broad appreciation.
Force no.
We start by understanding the second law of thermodynamics without any mathematics at all. You just say, well, you know, sod me, it's second law of thermodynamics is much up my day again, you know. It's just sort of
Well, meanwhile, while second law of thermodynamics is pontificating in its corner, that oak tree is doing an unbelievable act of operation of repetition in your face, and it is staggering. It's beyond all
the
belief.
exception, isn't it?
No, the nature is not an exception.
Nature's
all around.
Most of the things going on, our eyes are set up to see the room and
Okay.
but most of the things
All right, so there's an
on the
awful lot
other side of the
There's an awful lot of decay happening, but there's also an awful lot of new oak trees coming out exactly like the last
Yeah.
one.
Why
And a
do
lot
a
of
few
people coming out exactly like the
Let's
previous.
say, why do a few things not follow the same road down?
Okay, well, fine point, fine point. Well, what's that? That's very good.
Can I ask you a question? I often feel that if you get a message, it's important to know the characteristics of the messenger. What is this guy's background? What is he fascinated with?
I'll give it to you in 2 seconds. He studied law at Trinity College Dublin, and he said, what am I going to do to make money? And he went into commercial property for a year, and he thought, this is a load of rubbish, and I'm going to go and study. So he went to the British Museum library, where he sat for 2 years and studied absolutely everything he could possibly do about physics, philosophy, and he couldn't take anything in mathematics at all. And all this came to him in that period. Since then, he's been working in commercial property and writing this stuff and keeping it updated and so on.
I mean, trying to be, for me, a little bit more precise. I mean, was he fascinated with the idea of consciousness or the idea
He's
of
fascinated with the
life?
idea of repetition. It was almost an obsession. He had these insights one after the other. There were these 3 things which were all cases of repetition. So he said, can't we put together a theory? But nobody's explained how nature actually does these repeats. They're staggering. The memory is staggering. It can't all be written. The whole of Beethoven's piano concerto all written in there.
Well,
And
hang
so
on. I mean, if there was a biologist here, they would say that we don't know about morphogenesis, but they would know quite a lot about repetition and stuff like that. In fact, I would say that this question you raised, that there's something going against entropy, it's sort of accepted that life is going against entropy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the definition. It doesn't get you very far in the details, but that seems to be.
This guy's trying to sort of carve in a few details, maybe what life's made about.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah,
It's not
that's what they're
claiming
trying to
second
do.
law of thermodynamics, though, is it?
I don't really know how to say what he's talking about right now.
No, that's it. I mean, life stands against the second law of thermodynamics, exactly, just like Mike said. And this guy is trying to come up with some kind of theory which he's hoping that we will be interested in and create some mathematics for, that actually goes into some of these details of like, how is it that life occurs against all the second law of thermodynamics and the idea of entropy. That's my
The learning systems would be one of those, wouldn't it?
I don't know what they're called.
The which systems?
Learning systems.
Oh, learning systems, yeah. But that's what he's, learning systems depends on this repetition. Anyway, let's
let's
speak.
Look at the red. I've proposed that electromagnetic induction, the transmission effect over the distance, is one of these phenomena.
That doesn't have the same entropy effect in it. It's just
no, it's absolutely doesn't. I agree, and I'm confused about that. As you're absolutely right. Anyway, the red stuff says that what I'm looking for is ways of putting this stuff into some kind of maths or quantification. So I'm saying there might be a degree of repetition called E, which is due to the degree of repetition of the event. So that is an anti-entropy thing. This thing was repeated that many times. This event was repeated. Then there might be another for the number of events per unit of time. You'll see this sort of thinking gets more complicated when we get to DNA. At a scale, number 2, that is further from the subatomic, realization of the effect It's not a subatomic thing. It's happening in your DNA molecules, for example, and the first things, in both of these natural examples. No, in the brain and in the DNA molecule. Realization effect calls for very high degrees of repetition. So it could be degree of repetition of events or a repetition of structures or events that are of a very high degree of complexity. Yes, I've got it there because repetition with complexity contains a higher degree of departure from the random. In other words, what we're talking about is we set up some happenings that depart from the random, and that's what has the effect. If it's large enough, the complexity alone, with a bit of help from repetition, will infringe the limit rules on probability referred to here before. Okay, what are the devices that evolution has made in nature? Before humans devised the simplest demonstration of this repetition effect, the current down the wire which produces electromagnetic induction, before they did that, evolution devised devices that operate at the macro scale. In other words, they depend on huge degrees of similarity to function at all. Have I finished reading that second sentence? Yes, these effects are, in fact, sine qua non of our biological world. We couldn't be here, the world we know, without repetition of form in living things and the use of something called the brain. Device A, the really most important device that evolution has come up with, is a molecule which is enormous, which helps it, enables nature to reproduce form between generations of living things. It depends on 3 degrees of repetition. 1, let's talk about me reproducing and producing this person here, or my father producing me, or my mother producing me. It depends on billions of copies of the same DNA molecule in this body. That's a staggering degree of repetition. That's an extraordinary phenomenon to look at. The huge number of extremely similar DNA molecules that are in this body.
You've also got the enormous degrees of similarity with respect to all the trillions of cells in the body.
Yes, but the cells are pretty variable, but there's a great degree of similarity. One thing is that DNA is almost totally similar, which is almost a sort of walking singularity on this theory. So the second degree of similarity you're using when nature reproduces living forms is the millions of generations of repetition of the form, father, grandfather, about 1 million generations, going back into what we regard as the 4th dimension, depending on latest arguments about the number of dimensions. And then, of course, we've also got the fact that the organism you're producing is itself an extraordinarily complex product. So you've got all these degrees of repetition, which are extremely high, reinforcing each other and making it possible for this function here, this thing, to produce something which has a degree of similarity to it. What's the word? Faithfulness of reproduction. That is quite staggering if you look at it as a scientist. You have to be completely blown off your chair by the fact that it is staggering. And it results from 3 staggering degrees of similarity. The first one, invented by nature or evolution, how I haven't the faintest idea, in which this enormous molecule with billions of parts of a chain is repeated billions of times throughout human being and throughout all generations. Okay, so that's...
I'd like to make a comment about the quantum level, because while I'm not sure about the way you're using Heisenberg uncertainty, there is a principle which is correct that if you follow orthodox quantum mechanics called the no-cloning theorem.
Oh,
the no-cloning theorem says that you can't design at the purely quantum level a quantum process that will duplicate a quantum state.
Right.
Say that again, please.
You cannot design at the purely orthodox quantum level a process that's strictly quantum mechanical that will duplicate a quantum state, to make a brand new copy of a quantum state identical to the previous quantum
That,
state.
I think, possibly supports.
Which is saying you can't reproduce perfectly, you can't make a repetition at the strictly quantum level. And then you can look at that and you can say, well, oh, right, but then at some level, we are making these almost perfect copies of things, DNA and so on. How does that come about if at the most basic level you can't?
Well, DNA is a great big molecule.
Yeah, it is. But what I'm saying is that could be a way of expressing at least part of what you're saying, that there's
yes, you're supporting what I'm saying. I have no idea.
repulsion to making perfect copy at the most basic level.
I was going to say that absolutely appears to support this. What's the name of the theory?
No cloning theorem. No cloning.
No cloning.
And a fundamental ratio, but there's a significant body of literature that skirts that issue of the no cloning.
There's a lot of stuff that seems to be skirted in all this basic.
Now, there are people who want to subvert or get rid of or get outside the uncertainty principle, and they would also be wanting to get outside the no cloning in some way. So, there's a debate.
Yeah, it's all very good. It's all very good. Anyway, the second device, that the first one had to be DNA before there could be creatures. And then the trend of what's it called, a random mutation, came up with this sort of tumor thing. We had a perfectly good animal, and the sort of tumor began to grow on it with sort of electrical connections that conduct electricity. Before we knew where we are millions of generations later, we got heads that contain not just eyes, but these extraordinary, huge tumors which have electrical connections in them, which is a staggering fact. And of course, we've got the biggest one, so we're at the top of the food chain because we've got the biggest one. It's so...
maybe others more powerful will keep it quiet.
What? You can't really understand it. If I had a very small brain, I could perhaps take in and copy from yesterday a few small memories, but with a big brain I can copy a lot. What does the brain do? When it does memory, it reads by this principle from itself yesterday. The information of the whole of Beethoven's concerto is not written anywhere physically in this apparatus. It's just enormous enough, capable of being put into a random state so it can read its own state yesterday, and capable of producing what he calls holocepts, a thought he said might be a holocept, that are so complex that they qualify for this mechanism. In other words, nature's produced a way of memorizing, and the way it produced was this tumor with billions of connections in it.
The thing that comes to me with all this is to try and, I mean, I'm as amazed as anybody about the extreme cases of concentration of what we would call audio like that, but we don't really have very good grasp of even the simplest processes that do this. And that's the one that's really occupied me quite a lot over the past 3 or 4 decades. So it's odd. I don't know.
I'm jumping straight to conclusions.
Well, right, I don't think you've got a chance to handle it by jumping in the deep mud. You know?
Yes, I'm jumping in the deep mud. That's what he is. I rather like it. It's quite comfortable in that. Anyway, the way the brain does its memory thing depends on trillions, or is it billions, I don't know, of brain cells. Possibly massive repetition by the brain of the structure or the holocept. He says, you know, I look at Blue Book and it actually expands as a thing which is all throughout my brain. There's some things I've heard, you cut out part of the brain, the guy still remembers it, cut out another brain still. In other words, some things, the whole brain is remembering what he says might be a hugely complex picture for a simple concept. And of course, there's holocept images might themselves be incredibly complex. That's just speculation. So here's a quick look at these devices and degrees and types of similarity that they use to achieve their effect. I like this. This is, we am, therefore we think. In other words, to hell with Descartes. We couldn't think if we hadn't become this physical object. Right? The most interesting thing is that evolution happened. So I could go first to device B of nature's invention, the brain and memory. And I said this cool phrase is to illustrate that. First, evolution produced this device, B, the brain. Then afterwards, we were able to think. Retrieving a memory makes our present existence possible. We're able to think because creatures have evolved this tumor-like mass of ultra-repeated cells, multiple enough to use Greaves' mechanism to form a concept and to retrieve it from the same brain yesterday. In this case, the scale is non-subatomic, so what I'm really emphasizing in here is if we're trying to analyze, give this any kind of mathematical shape,
Another question. You then take it to be somehow primordial that things can be compared, that it can be that nature knows whether something is the same or different from something else.
Now, nature discovered that if it produced a system like a brain or a mass of DNA in which the degree of similarity became high, that would actually result in this next generation leaf looking the same. Nature discovered that by total chance and evolution, as Mr. Darwin said. Nature doesn't perceive that there's one stone standing on the other. It's just there, and it falls off because gravity says it will.
But singularity occurs
We don't know what
because of
nature
the
perceives.
proximity of similar entities. That's your principle.
Yes,
And that results in singularity.
yes.
So similarity is somehow detectable by nature to produce singularity.
Well, if you like to call it detectable by nature, I'm just saying that if it were to happen, then a singularity effect is produced. I can't go into much more deep
Yeah.
Wittgensteinisms on this with only 20 minutes to go. So, yes, this brain thing is not subatomic scale, so a huge degree of repetition is necessary, either in the complexity of the thing that it's remembering, or the image that it creates so that it can remember it, or in how many times it repeated it to itself. We all know that you want to remember a Christmas carol or a number or something, you repeat it, you repeat it, you repeat it, that puts it into your brain able to memorize. That's one of the functions in the short term. Yeah, and one of the functions we know there are many. So, being non-subatomic in scale, it operates using high repetition and high complexity. So, the red stuff is, I'm trying to invent mathematical terms. This one uses, this phenomenon uses degree of repetition of the event and degree of complexity of the item. I've got two funny little points here. One of them is that he says instincts are passed on from a creature to its son, just simply using this process. The duck wakes up and knows it has to quack and walk toward the water, because it's been imprinted, it reads it by this mechanism.
I agree with you on that one.
Okay, now the second one is of great interest to all here. It's called the inertia of belief. It's put forward by a physicist in the United States called Art Chester, who has worked on the Star Wars rockets program. He's a friend of Greaves and has a similar theory. He talks about the inertia of belief. The whole of a population holds on to a belief. And we, 17, come here to try to break that paradigm. And we can't do it. Why? Because it's been implanted in people's brains by this mechanism. That's what the paradigm shift is. It's when you manage to chip away at the previous inertia of belief, which is a Greavesian phenomenon. So, holding on to a once established concept by a whole population reinforced by Greavesian repetition between all their brains every day. When God save the Queen, God save the Queen, God save the Queen, God save the Queen. Everyone's got the same idea. So they just latch onto it, they can't question. Make it very difficult to win a consensus or even a hearing for a new idea, familiar to members of and no doubt. It was employed by demagogues who first put their crowd's brain into a random state, which is one of the mechanisms of Greaves' thing, using emotion or shock, and then they implant the ideas, which can be irrational or otherwise. Anyway, before there was the brain, there was DNA, the star tool of evolution, and a massive instance of Greavesian repetition. It was evolved for perpetuation of species. You'd say it was evolved for. Perpetuation of species happened because it evolved by chance. So life forms would be a chaos without this principle. Nature found a successful method to achieve repetition of form. Used a huge molecule, hugely repetitive molecule with, I think it's 1 billion instances of the same 4 things on that helical thing, isn't it? Something like that, some huge amount. So there will be a part of the, oops, done the wrong thing. Oh, where am I?
There.
Yeah, now press this one. One of the functions you might wish to use in trying to describe the degree of repetition would be one for internal repetition inside the DNA structure. That's one degree of repetition being used. Similarly, there's repetition between some billions of copies of that molecule within each individual example of the creature. So we might call that degree of repetition by copies inside the individual creature. And then there might be a third one, similarity across time, stretching back millions of generations, degree of repetition in the past, call that R subscript P, for example. What I'm trying to get at is I'm just trying to get towards the idea that there may be a way you can mathematically differentiate between the types and degrees of similarity that this function involves.
One question which occurs to me about similarity is, for instance, there is a problem that for Leibniz principles of indiscernibles is at odds with Parker-Rhodes' theory of indistinguishable. Because, according to Parker-Rhodes, you have several things which cannot be distinguished, but whereas in Leibniz, if something, this criterion of identity has the consequence that it's only unique thing identical to itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a notion of identity. So, how do you reconcile a notion of identity with the notion of similarity in mathematical or logical terms?
If you'll forgive me, at this point in building my cathedral, I'm going to skip that decoration inside the antechapel, if I may. I find it very respectable, but I'm not going to go to it for the moment because I'm just using broad language to get coming across. Anyway, so I'm dealing with this concept of repetition, which may or may not mean indistinguishable, distinguishable, absolutely right. So, how many functions, playing the game. How many, how many and what functions do you expect to need to describe one of these situations? That's the DNA situation. Here's another one. Okay, no, not one. Here's some of the potential operators, that's probably not the right word, terms perhaps it should be, in an approach to, the whole point about this speech is quantifying degree of repetition. How do we quantify it? And we can talk about whether it actually works, whether it's indistinguishableness or whatever. How would one quantify degree of repetition? How would you do it? So here are some first stabs by someone who's hardly ever written a mathematical formula in his life properly since A-level. So I say, we've got these, they're not actually operators, they're really terms. Will we perhaps arrive at a final value for each situation using these terms? We're going to do something between all these terms and it will give, for each situation, a suggested the parameter degree of similarity, which you might call DS. You might call that a degree of order, what is it? Or maybe you interpret it backwards as a degree of departure from randomness. Give it a name. Maybe the negative entropy contribution or something. So here are the terms we've looked at so far. In DNA and creatures, we've got 3. Repetition inside the structure of the molecule. Repetition by multiple copies inside the creature. And repetition in the past. In memory, we've got 2 at least. Repetition of a single event in the brain. And the degree of complexity of the item repeated. In electromagnetic induction, we've got degree of repetition of the event, the number of events per unit of time. All those are the sorts of variables that a really mathematically minded person might be able to say, okay, now I can see how we might be able to create the concept in size terms of degree of repetition or degree of departure from entropy. I'm saying, let's arrive at a way of expressing this amount. So, let's say this is the first stab. How many more should be devised? I think I'm quite close to the end. How might they interact? In the living creature example, it might be that you add them up. That's the first line. Surmise that the thing is done by adding, or maybe they're to be multiplied, or maybe it's e to the something. Or, what is it? We don't know, but maybe at least we've invented some terms. Since we have no concept of the relationship between them, not the operators, the terms, maybe we should say the effect called repetition in the life situation is the effect of that one operating on, the effect of that one operating on. I don't know how the operators work or what the relationship is, but I'm encouraging someone to think about doing some maths to make this some kind of reality. So I say how to proceed. what might these effects, how one, mathematically might one express these effects, and where do we go, how do we do it, does this make any sense? Now I've got two little stories. Get out my pointer. I told you this last year, I asked an astrophysicist from Cavendish, who I met especially, but I met him at a party, so I just had a chance to give 1 second. I said, could one make a maths of similarity, you know, that describes how similar systems are to each other, or something, and he instantaneously, like these people do, I suppose, reply instantaneously, they process the information instantaneously. He said, impossible, too many variables.
That's what you can call prejudice.
Prejudice. Impossible, too many variables. He's a master of astrophysics.
You think he could handle big numbers of it?
What?
You'd expect him to be able to handle big numbers.
Well, you realize they're both right.
Who?
The two protagonists, the other one.
The one at the bottom
says,
says,
yes, it's easy.
I'll just
And
explain
the other one
this
who
one.
says it's impossible.
Yeah, I asked the statistics PhD expert who might have simple. You just do what Newton did. You start with a couple of x-y axis diagrams with 3 points. This one, you move that one slightly, and then you say d by dt, if it's t, and then go on from there.
I don't agree with that. You don't agree with that.
And when Newton did it, which was, you know, wonderful thing, was let's cut it down to tiny bits and look at it.
Our request at the moment is to deal with the ideas of large numbers and that bottom-up approach is hard to do.
Okay, hard to do. Well, maybe you can. So what's my next
The reason I say they're both right is that the second guy says, well, we know how to quantize the differences. If we know how to quantize the differences, then we just start measuring them all. First guy is saying, I have no idea how to quantize the differences, and he's thinking of large-scale measures of how systems are behaving. And so, to the extent that you can quantize differences, you can measure similarity, yes.
Very good. Anyway, here's my thing for you to fill in. What I want to find out is whether last time I was there, I didn't know anything. I was totally overawed by talking to scientists or mathematicians at all. I said, oh, we're going now, tell them all about it. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had no idea whether anyone was taking it all seriously any of the steps. That's why this form I asked you to fill in.
Can I make a suggestion how I think the repetition could occur? This is a general suggestion. Essentially, I have this way of thinking, which comes from the quantum mechanics, but it applies to all the things as well. That you have the system and its environment, which is the rest of the universe, and that the total is always a zero of some kind. So the system and the environment look like each other in reverse. So the system is copied by the environment, and the system is produced by the environment at the same time. So you have a system, whatever it is, cell, DNA, particle, then it has to have the environment of that kind. Any slight variation in that environment, which is what happens all the time, will therefore require the environment to make a slight change in the system. A copy, but not quite the same.
Extremely elegant view, I thought. I know nothing about it, but I just thought it was fantastic. You know. But what does that do to the repetition thing?
That creates repetitions. It will create another version of what it had. The environment will want to create just as the system creates its environment, so the environment creates its system. But it won't be quite identical, but it will be similar.
Anton wants to speak and I want to speak as well.
Oh,
I'm Richard.
No, he's 10 minutes.
well, actually, I started.
Nikki's still 5 minutes here.
Yeah.
The one part where I actually feel I agree with you on that point on the DNA, I don't see the DNA as a collection of atoms as normal scientists see them that spring up and make this beautiful spiral. I see that spiral of collection of atoms as a carrier of a wave function in which is encoded memory that is inherited, like in the monarch butterfly, which I like always quoting in the USA. It gives the finer details of our features. If the one person has brown hair and the other one has blonde hair, you cannot see that in the atomic structure of the DNA. So I see this as the DNA as a holder of a wave function Now that wave function, by means of the resonances, and then when we come to Schoenberg's work of morphic resonances.
So what, of course, he's trying to put some
what he's
structure behind.
what he's putting structure behind. You know, I can assimilate with all that. You know, so I don't think what we heard today as all that strange. So it's different.
Okay, one thing I was going to say was, when Greaves wrote this stuff, it was all particles. He said, we've got a system of 3 particles, and I met on that day, I met the Cambridge whatnot. I met 3 astrophysicists from Cambridge. The other one, his name was Mahon, who was spelled out for me, H-A-H-O-N. With him I had an interesting conversation. He said, I am paid by the public to think. Some people think that's wrong. I said, no, that's absolutely wonderful. You're being paid to think. I think that should go on. Anyway, he said, I said, I'm going to give you a theory in 30-second sound bites, see what you think. So I gave him this theory. He said, Heisenberg, therefore they come in the same place, therefore if they were singularity, particles. He said, gobbledygook. Nobody uses particles anymore. Today everyone uses fields. So your DNA is not a series of objects. It's a field. Okay, but this, I've got billions of this same field in my body. So it still applies. It's very good. I love the idea though. But who am I to love or not love anything? I don't know.
Well, it sounds like I could suggest an angle which I think might broaden the view on this a bit. It's been with me quite a while. When we think about all these things, we talk about the complexity as we know it, but we live near the sun. The sun runs a lot faster and is a good bit bigger. And all sorts of shapes occur in that. There are ones which we don't know much about, and it's always naturally occurred to me that maybe that's where the life is, and we're just the green mold on the outflower area. And until we can get a reason for saying why we think that is less systematic than what we have around us here, then we have no right to that. But who or what is less systematic? The sun. We disregard the sun as being the boss in a region. We just think it was a heat generator.
You think it's just a great big thermal?
Yeah, not much going on. I think as we find out from the astronomers, gradually we're finding out there's more going on in the sun than you thought. Well, there could be blooming civilizations and everything, and they can read us on their low temperature. The trouble is, to read us, they've got to almost our temperature.
Right,
Very good, very good. But where does that, how germane is that to my attempt to find a way of making expressions?
It's a set frame of mind, so that you won't be so human-based. So you try and get the darn thing out into being what nature is.
Okay, that's good. Well, who am I ignoring by mistake here? Who wants to say?
I work with lawyers. I'm very distrustful of lawyers, and the basic reason is that they're not scientists, right? You're trying to get something done by a guy who spent 2 years in the middle of a library. It's common knowledge that to master a subject you spend at least 10,000 hours. He hasn't done his homework.
Oh, he'd been working on it.
In the end, I'm just going to summarise the meaning of gobbledygook for me. I agree 100%. Your man, Nick Greaves, he comes across as a materialist. And as the other guy said, you know, we've now got to deal with waves. In other words, I recommend that if you're going to go further with this, take some time out, 10,000 per topic, look at immaterial stuff. You can begin with information or complexity. Most of these things have been mastered. But you can't just do that by sitting in the library hoping that you can absorb all the knowledge. It is gobbledygook. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, well give me, please, on a piece of paper, 2 books I've got to read to start. As you said, so start with this and this.
Okay, I'll tell you one right now. There's a man called Walter Elsasser who tried to study this subject, and he was a first-class physicist, known with lots of good work. He started getting involved with this area, and he was discarded as a heretic and kicked out of the club.
Wouldn't he? Did he write his name down in his book or something? Guide me where to go. Have I got to the end of... Okay, well, I hope you've all filled in your forms. Anybody said I'm not that thin? Nobody cares about my request to see whether any of these things... Everyone's going to put a 0 on it, are they? Oh, here's somebody with a lot of numbers. Oh, all 0.
I'm afraid so, yes. But I think that you might find some traction with some people who are using mod 9 numbers.
Mod 9.
Well, you put 9 numbers around a circle and you trace various patterns, and they're linking those to patterns in DNA and the protein molecules and protein things that go on to DNA. I have, yes.
so I want to make a comment now still. The basic principle is Heraclitian. Heraclitian.
Hand spread, everything flows.
And you can't actually repeat. Nature doesn't want repeats, so repeats create singularities from your point of view. But then the next principle is very interesting, and it would be hard to vote on its validity or not, which is that when those singularities occur, new repetitions occur jumped in space-time, right? That's a fascinating idea. It reminds one of Rupert Sheldrake's idea that when something is invented here, it also gets easier to invent everywhere else.
Absolutely right.
But it also reminds one of Peter's idea that if you think of something happening locally, you really change the entire space, because what happens locally and what happens outside that locally are reciprocal to one another and add up to nothing.
Yeah,
so if you make a discovery here, you actually create a difference in the entire universe.
Good, right.
So it's interesting to compare all these things. I wouldn't want to give it a grade. I want to keep on thinking about it.
Okay. He was writing this first in 78 and 79, exactly when Sheldrake was writing his stuff. And he discovered Sheldrake in print in about 82 and has become a friend of Sheldrake. Sheldrake was overheard saying, although it was among some of Greaves's relatives, that guy Greaves, he's some kind of genius. But he might have just been being kind because he was actually the house of Greaves' in-laws.
Yeah, I want to put in a counter statement to Mike's. Ramanujan didn't do things the normal way, and he came up with a whole load of stuff, which the majority of which has still not been understood, but a lot of which...
It's probably wrong.
Well, no.
Yeah. So
not.
what is your point?
My point is that kind of the 10,000 hours in a certain kind of regime is what you need to actually, qualify as being able to state anything that's useful.
Ramanujan put in 10,000 but in a different way.
Yeah, but we don't know what Nick Greaves put in a non-standard way.
No, but Nicky, for what I remember about Ramanujan, people didn't say, "I don't understand what you're after." They were saying, "You must give us a proof," which is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, they did actually. They said it was rubbish. He was. I mean, no, but I mean, Hardy was one outstanding mathematician. Hardy was one over. No, Dino, Ramanujan had a terrible life here. Hardy was won over. The people, the rest of, he was in Trinity College.
Yes, I've seen the recent film on
Ramanujan.
Happy Brave, Stephen wants to have
I want to say one thing. First, he really has done 10,000 hours on his own, reading just about everything.
That's my point. There are disciplines applicable to this
that
already exist.
Yes.
Oh, right, so he should
that is
Oh yeah, proofs. One following experiment's been done. I told you about it too fast last year, so I'll tell you very quickly this year. Take some human brain stuff. Where'd you get that, eh? Well, they got it. Milan University, a lady's called Pizzi, P-I-Z-Z-I, you can look it up. She wired up bits of brain, one here, one there, to electrodes, put that one behind a Faraday cage, not far enough away, but quite a distance away, and shot a laser, just laser light, at this raw brain tissue. When she shot LED light, non-coherent, nothing happened over here. But when she shot coherent light, I mean, we know the brain tissue doesn't even really meant to even sense light, right? But when she shot coherent light at this brain tissue, a blip appeared over here, behind a Faraday screen, behind everything. Remote passage of a thing from brain to brain. Just look up Pizzi, P-I-Z-Z-I, Milan. Now, I've recently had a correspondence with her. I said, I'm going to talk to these ANPA people about this, and I'm going to say that you are a demonstration of Greaves' thing. And she said, no, don't do that. Since I last did that in 2008, I've done further experiments to try and find out what that anomaly was. And please don't say that I've proved his principle. What I did was I showed that, and she comes to the conclusion that something was going on in the equipment, that shooting the laser produced a magnetic field, and that her conclusion was very low magnetic fields can be felt by brain tissue, even though apparently it was behind the Faraday cage, which of course might not affect the magnetic field, but there we are. Pitsy, look her up, it's quite interesting. I wrote to her and said, it's impossible to understand the English of your presentation. I can't understand what your final conclusion was, please tell me. And I'm going to tell ANPA that your thing was a case of Greaves. She said, don't do that, it wasn't. We did some more research and found that it wasn't. So the experiment can be done, and is the basis of the book, which I'm trying to sell here, which I'm hoping you'll all buy, in which he persuades a rich man to finance the experiment. They get all proper people in, they actually do the experiment. Sure enough, the first Pitsy one works. And then he says, okay, that's the transmission over space. Now let's do the transmission over time so we can prove memory is a case of it. And they don't get around to doing that because they get something. There's a long conversation with a man from Science magazine at the end in which it all gets very... So I hope you'll all buy the book. That would be very nice, because that would be nice for his satisfaction as someone who wrote it all down. He got fed up with trying to persuade scientists of this, so he wrote it as fiction.
Give Stephen a big hand. If you want to stay on time, cut that coffee break short and come back at 11:30.
Yeah. And there's hot water there, the cups are there. Remember the housekeeping, please wash